How you doing, everybody? I'm Ken Bykoff, and welcome to O'Neill Speaks, the official podcast of the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. On August 12, 1986, then-President Ronald Reagan held a press conference in the Rosemont Ballroom of the Hyatt Regency Hotel in Chicago, the 38th of his presidency. Before taking questions, President Reagan said he wanted to send a special message to America's farmers, namely that he had a goal to remove what he believed were some regulatory barriers that were holding back the farmers' prosperity. And he phrased the viewpoint simply.
I've always felt the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
And with that phrase, President Reagan encapsulated the feelings of millions of Americans. Nearly 40 years later, the issue of the effectiveness of the United States government to be a positive influence on the country remains at the forefront of our political discourse. Americans are distrustful of the government and have deep questions about the role it should play in their lives. Seeking some answers to the issue is the impetus behind the upcoming Evidence-Based Solutions for Improving Federal Government Performance Conference, which will be held at the National Academy of Public Administration in Washington, D.C., January 13th. This one-day conference will feature a group of distinguished experts, including Kevin Kozar of the American Enterprise Institute, Amy Holmes from the Bloomberg Center for Government Excellence, Peter Warren, senior advisor to James Comer, who is the incoming chairman of the House Oversight Committee, Jennifer Mattingly of the Partnership for Public Service, and Renata Lemos from the World Bank. Philip Howard, chair of Common Good, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization which advocates simplifying government, will provide the keynote address. They will look at the critical question of what can be done to improve federal government performance. We're joined today by 2 of the organizers of that event, Professor Emeritus in Public Affairs and Philanthropic Studies Leslie Lenkowsky and Distinguished Professor Emeritus and Chancellor's Professor of Public and Environmental Affairs Emeritus Jim Perry. Professor Lenkowsky is an expert in volunteering and civil engagement, nonprofits and public policy, civil society and comparative perspective, education and social welfare policy, and social entrepreneurship. He was a founding director of the Corporation for National and Community Service, now known as AmeriCorps, during the Clinton administration, and he was appointed by President George W. Bush as CEO of the corporation in 2001. Professor Perry is an internationally recognized leader in public administration and the study of public management. His 45 years of scholarship include expertise in public management, public organizational behavior, government and civil service reform, national and community service, public service motivation, and performance-related pay. Les and Jim, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, first off, just where did the idea for the conference originate?
Well, like all many conferences we've been engaged in, who knows? But I can say I sort of tagged the origin of the idea of the conference to a meeting that Les and I had at the Uptown Cafe for lunch one day back in December 2023. So it's probably more than a year already, just slightly more than a year. Les, what do you remember?
Yes, I remember it exactly the same way. I'd been reading a lot about some efforts by Donald Trump in his first term to replace a lot of civil servants with people that would be presidential appointees. This is known as Schedule F. And while I had no idea at that time that Donald Trump would be coming back for a second term, I thought and discussed with Jim that the community of public administration scholars and practitioners didn't seem to be taking this very seriously, and that there needed to be a lot more attention paid to it for 2 reasons. First of all, although there's no question that the Trump administration's motives involved a lot of distrust of civil service, there was also a legitimate reason to take a close look at how we at the federal level at civil service. And the reason was quite simply we have not done that for about 30 years. The last major effort was during the Clinton administration, and a lot of things have changed, and we ought to be re-examining whether the way we recruit, promote, train civil service servants is as good as we hope it would be. The second reason is we all are aware that the American public does not have a lot of confidence in the operations of our federal government. And some scholars, such as NYU's Paul Light, have documented a large number of very well-publicized government failures in the past 30 or 40 years. The rollout of FAFSA, for example, or the milk formula problems are examples of these. And we ought to be, if we were really concerned about improving public confidence in government, we really ought to try and assess what is causing these failures, and especially to what degree do the causes have something to do with the quality of public servants. So that was the genesis of it, and we've just taken it by there. I think Professor Perry and I both agree changes ought to be based on good evidence and good research. And so the theme of this conference will be, what does the evidence say about what needs to be done, particularly with regard to civil service?
Well, you touched a little bit on what my question was going to be, is that it's just, I know federal government performance has been an important policy issue for decades. For either one of you, just take me through how it evolved from a concern to a key political priority.
Yeah, now Les, I think, touched on the sort of the movement from a concern to a political priority with sort of the dialogue associated with the first Trump administration. But let me sort of go back a little bit further, because you mentioned that I've been in this business for at least 45 years, which is close to accurate. It's more, it's a little bit more than 50. But I started studying this as an evaluator on the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. So there were two American presidents, one a Democrat and the other Republican, that placed federal performance high on their agendas. And these two presidents were Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. President Jimmy Carter brought government performance to center stage during his advocacy of legislative proposals that became the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, which, as I indicated earlier, was the act that I was one of the evaluators for. He promised a government, and this is a quote from Carter, as competent, as compassionate, as good as the American people. And again, looking at Paul Light's work, Paul looked from the end of World War II to the late 1980s, early 1990s, and found a lot of federal government successes. And so I think we did get what Carter was seeking, and we had it for many years prior to the passage of the Civil Service Reform Act. That is, we did get a competent, compassionate, and good federal civil service. So Carter's idea of reform, which he brought from the state of Georgia, where he reformed the civil service there, was to make government more successful rather than risk problems. And then Carter was opposed in the election of 1980 by Ronald Reagan. And Reagan who defeated Carter in the 80 election, popularized an alternative view, one that was quite different from the perspective that Carter brought to the exchange. And your earlier quotation from Ronald Reagan in 1986, I think, is an indication of how Reagan thought about this. But in his 1981 inaugural address, Reagan said, "Government is not the solution to the problem. Government is the problem." And so now that might have been founded on something different than the performance of civil servants, but it was certainly a different perspective. Both of those, both Carter and Reagan, raised this to a dialogue, because Civil Service Reform Act was viewed as Carter's primary domestic achievement, and he hung his hat on the civil service reform, although it wasn't too long into the civil service reform that Carter said, "This is very boring." And so he wasn't enamored with it, and he didn't sort of stay engaged for a long period of time. But so the difference between the latter half of the 20th century and present day American public life is that government performance is now, as you indicate, not merely an object of attention, but it's on a list of public problems. And the sort of the key phrase that's been used recently is refers to the idea that there's a deep state.
Yeah.
And that government and our American lives and the American political system is actually controlled by unelected bureaucrats. Now, that's a perspective, not necessarily a reality or the evidence. But that's certainly a concern, and that's been one reason why it's been elevated.
Well, I'd just like to add to that. I agree there's a lot of political rhetoric in this discussion of the deep state and so on, but there's also an important point behind it, and it has to do with the accountability of our civil service to our political officials. And this has been a perennial topic in American history. And not just American, you'll find similar things in other countries as well. To what degree do people who are working for the federal government as career civil servants owe loyalty to an incoming group of elected and appointed officials? And to what degree do we expect them to operate in a more neutral way, one driven by laws, by expertise, and other things? And this has always been an issue. Certainly the rhetoric about the deep state reflects a lot of political language, but beneath it, and I think this is something we hope to examine in our conference, beneath it is a serious concern about accountability in government.
What are some of the issues that you guys are looking to address in this conference?
Well, we've got lots of issues. Our issues are open-ended, in part because we don't want to say up front, this is the problem or these are the problems. And so one reason why we're assembling these experts and they're going to be commenting is because they really sort of cover the spectrum of possible areas where we might find some improvements in federal performance. But let me just touch on a few. One is clearly the issue of long-term fiscal health, which has gotten very little attention, got almost no attention during the recent presidential election. And one of our presenters, Comptroller General Gene Dodaro, who heads the Government Accountability Office, which is an arm of Congress, has been concerned for many years about the sustainability of our sort of fiscal capacity and our ability to survive with the large national debt that we have, and that this is becoming a bigger concern. It's also a concern partly because the election didn't give people a lot of comfort that the national debt was going to be decreased. It's going to. There's a good prospect it will be increased, and so the question is, what are the consequences of that? But clearly, the ability to balance our budget and the ability to sort of look long-term to the fiscal health of the government, federal government, is an important component of federal government performance, and one that probably much better controlled by Congress than it is by the bureaucrats.
I think it's also important that the conference itself is an important event with sponsorship of the O'Neill School, National Academy of Public Administration, the Partnership for Public Service, with the conference occurring a week before presidential inauguration, and with the excellent list of presenters and discussants we will have. What we're hoping to do is really elevate what is now very much a politicized discussion to one that that people see deserves serious attention, that proposals for reform should be based on good evidence and research, and that we ought to be addressing the performance of the federal government in a constructive way if we want to see confidence by the public rise.
Les mentioned already this issue of accountability. And that has been sort of an ongoing concern, one that dates to my familiarity and my initial investigations of federal government performance and the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. But some of Reagan's advisors, like James Shirk, call into question the adequacy the performance management of civil servants. That same issue is raised by the Partnership for Public Service, who has a much different sort of portfolio than the political leadership or incoming political leadership. So this is, in terms of the major issues we're going to be dealing with, one is obviously this issue of the accountability of employees, as Les has already noted. Another facet of that is that the political appointment process needs to be reformed, and that's also a concern of the Trump administration and of groups like the Partnership for Public Service, because Congress over time has become slower in making or in vetting candidates for political appointment, and that's slowed the ability of the president to sort of implement his or her agenda, in all cases so far, his agenda. But so the political appointment process, as well as the process for overseeing and making civil servants, careerists accountable, are sort of important facets that sort of are very much of interest to the people who are going to be participating in this conference, and have been fingered as issues that, if we can get them fixed, will make a difference in terms of federal government performance.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's also important, just to pick up on something Professor Perry just mentioned, that we have not only the Comptroller General as part of this conference, but also a key staffer on one of the oversight committees. I think it is fair to look at whether or not Congress, which after all represents the American people in Washington, has been doing an adequate job of oversight of federal agencies. This, too, is not a new issue, but while there are obviously some notable oversight hearings that have gone on in recent years, they tend to be driven mostly by political considerations, what gets attention on the evening news, and so on. But one of the most important things Congress does is to continually look at how agencies are performing and hold them to account if they are not performing well. That has not been happening as much as it should.
As two people that are really have studied this area, the people who work in the agencies themselves, whether they are pointed at as being deep state operatives and all that rhetoric that goes along with it, what do they see as maybe being some of the barriers that they face when it comes to doing their job as best that they can, and how do they feel just about being pointed at as basically to blame for a lot of these ills?
Yeah, Professor Lenkowsky put his finger on sort of a key factor here, and that is to what extent do the civil servants need to be responsive to the political leadership? And one of the controversies is that all federal civil servants in the U.S. take an oath to the Constitution. That is, that in the sense that the president will take on January 20, 2025, an oath to the Constitution to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Their first obligation is to the Constitution and to the rule of law as sort of an extension of the Constitution. But that still doesn't necessarily mean there aren't some areas where they might be perceived as being unresponsive, and simultaneously unresponsive in ways that diminish the ability of the political leadership to lead or to direct their public policy. And that's sort of really the crux of the whole issue is, to whom are they responsible? Are they responsible to the mission of their agencies, to the law that guides their agency and under which their agency was created and operates? Are they responsible ultimately to the larger Constitution of the United States and not to a particular individual who has sort of a constitutional role but is not sort of the beginning and end of the constitutional obligation that or duty these civil servants have. So that's been an ongoing issue of controversy, and one that even Reagan had issues with the responsiveness of civil servants. But I think at some point the Reagan administration became comfortable with their relationship with the federal bureaucracy. Donald Trump is obviously less comfortable and would like to see the rules changed in some significant way.
Well, you asked what do people who actually work in government think about this, and I have been privileged to have senior management roles in two federal agencies, one in the Reagan administration as well as in Bush 43. And my sense is you could kind of group this into a number of categories. One is always financial, and whether we are providing not only the right amount of funding, but funding for the right sorts of things. In the Reagan administration, I was the deputy director of the U.S. Information Agency, and we had members of our staff in every embassy around the world to work with the press, with other cultural leaders. We had very little money for them, say, to take somebody to lunch or have a drink to talk to them. So what's being funded? What do we expect of them? Sometimes we expect too much of our civil servants. Sometimes we're not very clear. We pass laws or create programs with vague objectives. And a number of the professionals in government I've worked with would like a lot more clarity. What exactly is it do you want us to do? And then there's the third point, which is the one that Professor Perry mentioned before and turns out to be a relatively recent development, and that is we've been trying to put in lots of different ways of measuring performance management systems. This really began in the Johnson administration in the 60s, but has certainly taken on a lot more importance following President Carter, President Reagan. Former Governor Daniels was a big advocate of performance-based management when he headed the Office of Management and Budget under President Bush 43. So what's the right way to measure performance is always a big issue, and it's of concern to the various interest groups.
What kind of outcomes are you anticipating for the evidence-based solutions for improving federal government performance conference? What do you hope comes out of this?
Well, I would say a novel part of the conference is that we're going to use much of the afternoon for a conversation among the people who are attending. And many of the people who are attending are experts in different areas and diverse areas of government performance. But our goal is, I think, to develop a range of answers to one of the two questions that's prominent in the conference, and that question is what can be done to improve federal government performance. So we're going to have small group discussions and generate a range of ideas about government or performance management of career civil servants, about the appointment of political appointees and how we sort of move that along faster and improve that process, about technology, about the fiscal health of the government. And so, our hope is to come out with answers that can be perhaps put before congressional committees who are trying to solve issues related to federal government performance. So it's to come up with answers to significant questions, and we've got two significant questions. What makes a difference in federal agencies succeeding or failing? And secondly, what do we need to do to change the results when they don't come out right?
Well, listen, Jim, I really appreciate you joining me to talk about this issue, and I hope the evidence-based solutions for improving federal government performance conference can make a difference for everyone in the future. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Well, that's all the time we have Well, that's all the time we have today on O'Neill Speaks. O'Neill Speaks is the official podcast of the Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. All opinions and comments on O'Neill Speaks belong to the host and the guests of the O'Neill School and don't necessarily reflect those of the school itself. Music for O'Neill Speaks is by Manos Mars. Be sure to subscribe to O'Neill Speaks on Apple Podcasts or on your favorite podcatcher app so you don't miss an episode. We're out of time, but for now, and for the O'Neill School, I'm Ken Bykoff saying thanks for listening, everybody.